Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
This is the Daily History Chronicle, where we explore the moments that shaped our world and discover why they still matter today. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. On the evening of February 26, 1815, a 45-year-old man slipped out of his palace on the island of Elba, boarded a ship called the Inconstant, ironic name, and sailed away with about 1,000 soldiers. The British ship assigned to watch him was gone. The French guard ships were absent. It shouldn't have been possible. But Napoleon Bonaparte had never been very good at accepting what was possible. 9 months earlier, he'd been forced to abdicate as Emperor of France. The greatest military mind of his generation, the man who had dominated Europe for a decade, had been defeated, exiled to a tiny island in the Mediterranean, given a palace, a small income, and 400 guards. He was supposed to be finished. Europe had moved on. The Congress of Vienna was redrawing the map, restoring the old monarchies, and establishing a new peace. And Napoleon looked at all of this and thought, I can take it all back. What followed was one of the most audacious gambles in history. 100 days that would end at Waterloo, but which began with an escape that probably shouldn't have worked. Understanding why Napoleon did this requires holding several truths at once. He was a military genius staging a brilliant comeback. He was also a man addicted to power who couldn't accept being ordinary. The French people genuinely welcomed his return, but that welcome was built on delusion about what was actually possible. His escape was daring and charismatic. It was also reckless beyond measure. All of those things are true. Picture this: Elba, February 1815. Napoleon spends his days improving the island, building hospitals, expanding water supplies, and drilling his small guard of 400 soldiers. To outsiders, he seems resigned. His British monitor, Neil Campbell, noted he'd become inactive and corpulent. Napoleon was putting on weight, dealing with hemorrhoids and urinary problems. He looked like a man settling into comfortable obscurity. But Napoleon was reading everything, every scrap of news from France, every report from the Congress of Vienna. And what he read gave him hope. In France, the restored Bourbon king, Louis XVI, was deeply unpopular. Veterans of the Grand Army were being treated with contempt by returning royalist nobles. The French Empire had been shrunk back to its old borders, and the French people hated it. Meanwhile, in Vienna, the great powers, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, were on the verge of going to war with each other over how to divide the spoils. Napoleon calculated the odds. If he returned, the French people would rise up to support him. The Allied powers would be too busy fighting amongst themselves to stop him. He could retake Paris without firing a shot. It was delusional, but it was also, for about 20 days, absolutely correct. When Campbell left Elba for mainland Italy on February 16th, Napoleon saw his chance. He'd been hearing rumors that he might be moved to a more remote prison, possibly St. Helena in the South Atlantic, the same island where he would eventually die. Better to risk everything now than wait to be buried on a rock in the middle of nowhere. On February 26th, with the guard ships absent, Napoleon loaded his 400-man Imperial Guard plus about 600 additional volunteers onto the brig Inconstant and 4 small transports. His timing was perfect. They sailed away from Portoferraio harbor in darkness. They landed at Gulf Juan, near Cannes, on March 1st. A crowd gathered to watch. One mayor, seeing how few soldiers Napoleon had brought, said to him, "We were just beginning to be quiet and happy. Now you're going to stir us all up again." Napoleon issued a proclamation. The eagle will fly from belfry to belfry until it reaches the towers of Notre Dame. Then he started marching north toward Paris. This is where the story becomes extraordinary. Napoleon chose his route carefully, through the Alps, avoiding royalist Provence. It's marked today as the Route Napoleon. In 6 days, his small force marched 300 kilometers through mountain passes. Every town they entered, people came out to see the returned emperor. On March 5th, south of Grenoble, they encountered the 5th Infantry Regiment, sent by Louis XVIII to arrest Napoleon and bring him back to Paris in an iron cage. Napoleon did something that still takes my breath away when I think about it. He rode forward alone, dismounted his horse, walked toward the regiment until he was within gunshot range. Then he opened his coat, bared his chest, and shouted, "Here I am, kill your emperor if you wish." The soldiers lowered their muskets. Then they shouted, "Vive l'Empereur! Long live the emperor!" The entire regiment joined him. Think about the psychology of that moment. Napoleon was gambling that these soldiers, who had served him, who had fought across Europe under his command, would remember who he was and what they'd been together. He was gambling that their oath to Louis XVI was newer and weaker than their loyalty to the man who'd led them to glory. He was gambling with his life. And he was right. The next day, the 7th Infantry Regiment joined him. Then Marshal Michel Ney, who had promised Louis XVIII he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, arrived with 6,000 men. Ney saw Napoleon, kissed him, and forgot his oath to the Bourbon king. Napoleon's army grew as he marched, not through conquest, through charisma. Entire regiments simply switched sides when he appeared. By the time he reached Paris on March 20th, 20 days after landing in France, Louis XVIII had fled to Belgium without a fight. Napoleon walked back into the Tuileries Palace. He'd retaken France without firing a single shot. It was the most brilliant comeback in military history. It was also completely doomed. Because while Napoleon was marching through France, the Congress of Vienna learned of his escape. On March 13th, 7 days before Napoleon reached Paris, they declared him an outlaw, not an enemy, an outlaw. Outside the protection of the law, it is a fair game for anyone. The Allies immediately stopped fighting each other and formed the 7th Coalition. Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia. They pledged to field between 750,000 and 1 million soldiers to destroy Napoleon once and for all. Napoleon had about 46,000 soldiers when he retook Paris. He eventually increased that to maybe 200,000. The math was brutal. He tried to shore up support. He introduced liberal reforms, the additional act to the Constitution of the Empire, drafted by Benjamin Constant. It granted the French people rights they'd never had before. Free speech, limits on imperial power, a more democratic government. But people saw through it. These reforms came from a man who'd ruled as a dictator for over a decade. The changes felt hollow, half-hearted. Napoleon's support began to decline almost as soon as he regained power. Still, he was Napoleon. He knew war. On June 16th, he defeated the Prussian Field Marshal Blücher at the Battle of Ligny. He fought Wellington to a draw at Quatre Bras. For a moment, it seemed possible he might actually pull this off. Then came June 18th, 1815, Waterloo. Napoleon faced Wellington's Anglo-Allied army near a small Belgian village. He had about 72,000 men. Wellington had about 68,000, with Blucher's Prussians, who Napoleon thought he'd neutralized at Ligny, racing to reinforce him. The battle lasted all day. Napoleon's Imperial Guard, the elite troops who'd never been defeated, made their final charge up the ridge toward Wellington's line. They couldn't break through. When the Guard retreated for the first time in their history, the rest of the French army panicked. The Prussians arrived. The French army collapsed. Between 25,000 and 31,000 French soldiers were killed or wounded. Napoleon's dream ended in mud and blood on a Belgian hillside. He returned to Paris on June 21st and abdicated for the second time on June 22nd, this time in favor of his 4-year-old son, Napoleon II, who would never actually rule. Napoleon fled to Rochefort, hoping to escape to the United States. But British ships blockaded the port. On July 15th, he surrendered to Captain Frederick Maitland of HMS Bellerophon. He thought the British would give him asylum in England. Instead, they sent him to St. Helena, that remote island in the South Atlantic he'd feared. He would die there 6 years later, at age 51. We're still asking ourselves what Napoleon's 100 days actually meant. On one level, it was pure hubris. A man so addicted to power that he couldn't accept being ordinary, even when accepting it meant living comfortably on a beautiful Mediterranean island. Napoleon had a chance to age gracefully, to write his memoirs, to watch his son grow up. He threw it all away for one more roll of the dice. But it was also more complicated than that. The Bourbon Restoration genuinely was unpopular. Louis XVIII genuinely was incompetent. The French people genuinely did welcome Napoleon back. For those 20 days of marching from Caen to Paris, Napoleon's bet looked brilliant. Maybe he really could unite France again. Maybe the Allies really would be too divided to stop him. The fact that he was catastrophically wrong doesn't mean he was crazy to try. What troubles me most about the 100 days is the question of self-awareness. Did Napoleon know he was probably going to fail? The evidence suggests yes. He understood the mathematics. He knew the Allies would eventually unite against him, but he gambled anyway, because the alternative, spending the rest of his life on Elba, was psychologically unbearable. That scene at Grenoble haunts me. Here I am. Kill your emperor if you wish. Was that brilliance or desperation? Courage or manipulation? Strategic genius or the act of a man with nothing left to lose? All of those, probably. The philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote about how action, true political action, requires the courage to begin something new without knowing how it will end. Napoleon's escape from Elba was exactly that kind of action. Audacious, brilliant, ultimately tragic. He initiated something he couldn't control and it couldn't stop. The consequences went far beyond Napoleon himself. The harsher peace terms imposed on France after Waterloo created resentments that would simmer for decades. Marshal Ney, who'd kissed Napoleon and forgotten his oath to Louis XVIII, was executed by firing squad in December 1815 for treason. Napoleon's brief return hardened European conservatism and strengthened the forces of reaction. But it also proved something important, that popular will matters. Napoleon retook France without firing a shot because soldiers and citizens chose him over their lawful king. That terrified Europe's monarchs. It showed them how fragile their restored thrones actually were. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, ask yourself, when do we admire audacity, and when do we call it recklessness? How do we know when to accept defeat gracefully and when to risk everything on one more chance? And what does it say about human nature that we're still captivated by Napoleon's impossible gamble 2 centuries later, even knowing how it ended? Because that's what February 26th, 1815 teaches us. Not just about Napoleon, but about the seductive danger of believing we can recapture what we've lost, and the thin line between courage and catastrophic misjudgment. Thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this episode, then please subscribe. If you really enjoyed it, then please tell a friend. I hope you will join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history.